Those tricky little prepositions. Even while working as an editor, I've never been one of those grammar Nazis. I see language as something that is constantly evolving. And although you might consider that there are certain rules that you have to follow, much of what we call rules are actually just conventions or reflections of common usage. So language changes over time, and what was once acceptable becomes unacceptable, and vice versa. Today I want to talk a little bit about prepositions, which are tricky little buggers in English. In case you're not quite sure, a preposition is those little words like on, in, at, to, towards, into, that usually describe the placement of something or the movement towards something or from something. They're little words that it's very difficult to know how to use correctly if you're learning English as a second language. I know when I was working with students who were trying to write their papers, and if they were from another country or spoke another language, one of the most difficult things to master was these little prepositions, because their application in English seems to be so arbitrary. Often there was no explanation I could give to these students as to why this word is used rather than that word, than simply, it just sounds right. For example, in English we say that we did something on Monday in August at night. But why do we do something on Monday? It could just as easily be in Monday, because it takes place within the boundaries that determine the beginning and end of that day. Or it could be in night for the same reason. Indeed, why does there have to be a preposition at all? Why not just say, I did it Monday? We say that someone walks up the street, but down the street means exactly the same thing, unless that is we're following some kind of rule related to the numbering of the houses. I remember in my first book when I talked about walking up or down Fifth Avenue or something towards another street, an American reader wrote to me saying that, look, if you're going from here to here, you don't walk up Fifth Avenue, you walk down Fifth Avenue. They were following the numbering schedule. But generally I don't give the street numbering a thought when I talk about walking up or down a street. Some words require prepositions and some don't. For example, we talk about something, but we simply discuss it. This difficulty with prepositions is not restricted to English. I've encountered similar problems, huge difficulties, trying to cope with the use of prepositions in French. Of course, one of the things that has plagued the use of prepositions down through the centuries is the so-called rule stating that a sentence must not end with a preposition. There's that well-known protest by Winston Churchill when he was criticised by one of his editors for using a preposition at the end of a sentence, and he replied in something like these words: "This is a sort of bloody nonsense up with which I will not put." Actually, as far as I can ascertain, there has never been such a rule not to use a preposition at the end of a sentence, although prepositional fundamentalists become apoplectic if the rule is broken. It signals the end of civilization as we know it. There are clearly cases where ending the sentence with a preposition is much to be preferred over constructing convoluted sentences such as that used by Churchill to illustrate the point. "That's not something we choose to talk about" is surely preferable to "that's not something about which we choose to talk." Who would say that in actual English? It's tidier to say, "Which shop are you going to?" than "To which shop are you going?" Again, who would actually say that in English? As long as they have a place in the English language, in many, I don't say all, cases, prepositions can comfortably end sentences. So where does this so-called rule about never ending a sentence with a preposition come from anyway? Well, it seems that towards the end of the 18th century and on into the 19th century, Latin was viewed as far superior to English. So attempts were made to force English grammar to mirror Latin grammar. Well, in Latin, you actually can't end a sentence with a preposition, so they applied it to English. So before we mount on our high horses, we need to remind ourselves that many, if not all, great writers have readily ended sentences with prepositions. Francis Bacon once wrote in the 16th century, "Houses are built to live in, not to look on." It's difficult to see how you would say that without ending both clauses of that sentence with a preposition. And note that if the rule applies at all, it must surely apply to clauses in sentences as well as to whole sentences. So let's conclude this video with a short extract from the writings of a little-known 16th, 17th century English playwright. By a sleep to say we end the heartaches and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than to fly to others that we know not of.